Peter denied Jesus 3 times in a single night, and after that he wept bitterly, went back to fishing and spent days believing he had wasted the only thing that mattered. And it was exactly this man that the Holy Spirit chose to write about the enemy. Not Paul, who had never publicly denied him, not John, called the beloved disciple. Peter, the one who failed visibly, documented irreversibly at the most critical hour in human history. Why? Because Peter knew the enemy from the inside, not as a theological concept, as an architect who studied the entry points of a structure because he himself had been the open door. And in 1 Peter 5:8, he writes with the precision of someone who learned the hard way, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Most people read this verse and think of obvious sin, of moral temptation, of clearly wrong choices that open doors for the enemy. But Peter isn't talking about that. He is talking about something much quieter, much more common, much harder to identify because it doesn't seem spiritual, it just seems human. He is talking about fatigue, not character weakness, not a lack of faith. Fatigue, the accumulated kind, the kind you don't name because it seems normal after decades of living life intensely, the kind that builds cracks in a structure that looks solid on the outside until the pressure finds the crack and the door opens. Peter knows this because he was tired in Gethsemane. Jesus asked the disciples to stay awake and pray. Peter slept 3 times. And hours later, facing a servant girl who recognized him by the light of a fire, the structure gave way, not out of malice, out of fatigue that had compromised the foundation without him realizing it. This is the pattern that Peter documents for you. And the spiritual law he identifies is this: the enemy doesn't attack the strength. He attacks the crack that fatigue created where there was once a solid foundation. And if you stayed with me in the previous videos, if you cultivated the field of Philippians, if you positioned yourself in the throne room of Revelation, if you resolved the deep psychos of James, you built something real spiritual structure. The enemy knows this, and he will look for the crack. Further on, we are going to say a prayer of inspection and structural reinforcement, not a prayer of defeat asking for protection from someone who fears the attack. A spiritual engineer's prayer that identifies every vulnerable point, decrees reinforcement over every crack, and establishes active vigilance, not as anxiety, but as authority. But first, you need to understand what Peter really saw. Because what he documents in 1 Peter 5 is not theory. It is the floor plan of the enemy's method, drawn by someone who was the case study. Stay with me, because what Peter learned from his own fall might be exactly what will prevent yours. Open with me to 1 Peter 5:6-11. Let's read the entire block before breaking it down, because verse 8, the roaring lion, is not isolated. It is at the center of an architectural sequence that begins with a foundation and ends with a reinforced structure. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Now let's build this layer by layer, because every verse here is a layer of foundation, and the order of the layers is not accidental. It is spiritual engineering. The foundation before the vigilance, verses 6 and 7. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God. The Greek word here is tapenothete, to lower oneself, to place oneself under, to submit one's own weight to a larger structure. It is not humiliation in the sense of belittling oneself. It is the act of an engineer who recognizes that the structure he is building needs a foundation that he cannot manufacture alone. And Peter places this immediately before the instruction about the enemy, not by chance, because the structure without the correct foundation does not withstand the pressure, and the enemy applies pressure with surgical precision to the points where the foundation is compromised. Then comes verse 7. casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. The word epiripsantes, casting, is violent in the original. It is not gently place, it is to hurl with force, like someone who throws a weight they were carrying on their shoulders and hurls it far away with the deliberate intention of not picking it back up. And Peter specifies, pasan, all. Not the anxiety that seems spiritual enough to bring to God, not just the big worries, all anxiety. Because here is the architectural law that Peter understands from experience. Uncast anxiety becomes undistributed structural weight. And weight concentrated in a single point creates exactly the type of tension that produces a crack. In Gethsemane, Peter did not cast his anxiety. He slept with it. And when the pressure arrived, a servant girl, a fire, a simple question, the concentrated weight gave way. You might be carrying weight that seems too small to bring to God. The worry about the grandson who is making decisions you don't approve of but don't know how to address. The physical pain you mention to no one because you don't want to seem weak. The feeling that your generation failed to pass on something essential. The Sunday afternoon loneliness when the house is quiet and you can't exactly name what is missing. Are these not big enough weights for prayer? They are exactly the weights Peter says to hurl, because small uncast weights accumulate, and structural accumulation creates cracks. The diagnosis of the enemy's method, verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Two Greek words here that change everything. Nepsate, be sober. Not sobriety in the sense of abstinence, sobriety in the sense of an unobstructed mind, undulled perception, the ability to evaluate the structure clearly. The opposite is not drunkenness, it is numbness. It is the state you are in when accumulated fatigue dulls your perception to the point that you no longer notice what is coming in. Gregoris 8. Be vigilant, to stay awake, to remain in an active state of alert. It is the same word Jesus used in Gethsemane when he asked the disciples to stay awake. The word Peter heard directly from Jesus and failed to obey. He did not forget that word. He never forgot it again. Now, like a roaring lion. This is where most interpretations get it wrong. The lion's roar is not the hunting method, it is the conclusion of the hunt. A roaring lion is already in position. He has already found the entry point. The roar is the final attack, not the beginning of the search. The verse says that the enemy walks about, walks around, circles, inspects the perimeter. This happens in silence, patiently, with a specific intention, seeking whom he may devour. Tina katapien, literally to swallow completely, to submerge, to make disappear inside. Peter is describing not a frontal attack, but a silent perimeter inspection, looking for the vulnerable point. And the vulnerable point the enemy looks for is not where you are morally weakest. It is where fatigue has created a structural crack that you haven't noticed yet. Let me be specific about the type of fatigue Peter is describing. Because there are several types and not all are vulnerabilities. There is normal physical fatigue, a body that has used energy and needs rest. That is not a vulnerability. It is correct functioning that has a simple remedy: sleep, rhythm, care. The fatigue Peter knows from experience is different. It is the accumulated fatigue of undischarged spiritual responsibility. It is the weight of decades of being the strong person in the family, the one others depend on. The anchor, the one who holds things together without ever having a real space to unload their own weight. You know this fatigue, not because you are weak, because you are faithful. Because for decades you have been the steady presence, the father or mother who didn't let the children see how exhausted they were, the spouse who supported the other during an illness without ever receiving equivalent support, the congregation member who served in every available ministry because there was a need and you knew you could. Long faithfulness without regular offloading creates structural fatigue, and structural fatigue doesn't show up immediately. It accumulates silently, like moisture inside a wall that looks solid on the outside, until the day the right pressure reveals that the internal structure had been compromised for a long time. Peter slept in Gethsemane not because he was lazy, because he was structurally exhausted from 3 years of intense ministry without the kind of offloading that Jesus practiced regularly: the solitary retreat, the early morning alone in prayer, the deliberate rhythm of renewal. Peter watched Jesus do this repeatedly, and he didn't apply it to himself, because it seemed there was always more to do, more people in need, more immediate urgency that outweighed the need for structural renewal. Sound familiar? Peter identifies 3 doors that fatigue consistently opens. They do not appear explicitly in verse 8, but they are documented in the pattern of his own fall and in the letters to the communities he pastors. The first door, dulling of spiritual perception. When you are structurally tired, your ability to discern what is coming in diminishes. You become less able to notice when thoughts that are not yours are being installed as if they were. The voice that says, "You've given enough, no one would notice if you stop now," begins to sound like personal wisdom instead of an enemy perimeter inspection. Peter didn't realize when fear began to govern his response to the servant girl. He simply reacted, because his perception was dulled by accumulated fatigue, and he lacked enough structural sobriety to identify what was happening in real time. The second door, isolation as apparent protection. Structural fatigue produces the impulse to withdraw, to simplify, to shrink the circle of responsibility to manage the remaining energy. And there is wisdom in simplification, but there is danger when simplification becomes isolation, because isolation removes the support structures that were designed to distribute the weight. 1 Peter 5:9 says, "Knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world." Peter is not giving generic comfort. He is giving architectural instruction. The structure of community is not optional for someone under pressure. It is part of the engineering design. When you isolate yourself because you are tired, you remove precisely the structural support that was designed for moments of fatigue, and a structure without lateral support collapses more easily under vertical pressure. The third door, defensive rigidity disguised as firmness. Structural fatigue sometimes produces the opposite of softening. It produces hardening, a rigidity that looks like strength, but is actually the structure refusing to bend because it no longer has enough elasticity to bend and bounce back. You know this when you see it in others. The person who got so tired of being hurt that they built walls so solid that not even grace can get in anymore. Who became hard not out of malice, but out of self-preservation of a structure that hasn't been renewed. Peter experiences this in its most extreme form when, hours after denying Jesus 3 times, he goes back to fishing, not out of disbelief, out of the rigidity of a structure that no longer knew how to receive restoration. John 21 is the most important chapter for understanding what Peter is teaching in 1 Peter 5, because John 21 is where Jesus responds directly to the structural fatigue that produced Peter's fall. Jesus doesn't confront the sin directly. He doesn't say, "Explain what happened that night." He cooks fish, he serves. He creates an environment of care before creating an environment of restoration. And then, 3 times, he asks the same question. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" 3 times, corresponding to the 3 denials, not out of cruelty, out of structural engineering. Every declaration of love from Peter reinforces a point where the structure had given way. Each question and answer is like applying reinforcement material to a specific crack. And in the end, Jesus doesn't say, "Now that you have been restored, be more careful." He says, "Follow me." The instruction is not for Peter to watch himself more intensely. It is to keep his eyes in the right direction. Because correct vigilance is not obsessive self-monitoring. It is directional orientation. It is the difference between a sentinel who keeps looking at his own chest, checking if it's working properly, and a sentinel who is keeping an eye on the horizon from where the threat might come. Peter learned this. And that is why in 1 Peter 5:8, he doesn't say, "Watch yourselves." He says, "Be vigilant, with your gaze directed outward, toward what is circling the perimeter, not inward in a spiral of anxious self-evaluation." Now look at the complete sequence that Peter builds. Foundation, humbling under the hand of God. You recognize that you are not the primary structure. God is. Load release, Casting all anxiety, you distribute the weight correctly instead of leaving it concentrated in points that create tension. Sobriety, unobstructed perception. You maintain the ability to notice what is entering the structure. Vigilance, oriented gaze. You monitor the horizon instead of monitoring yourself obsessively. Resistance, anti-state, literally to stand against, to maintain structural position, not to counterattack with your own strength, to hold the position that the correct foundation allows. And then verse 10 delivers the final architectural promise: the God of all grace will perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. 4 verbs. 4 actions of structural reinforcement. Katartizai, perfects, restores to the original state of functionality. Where fatigue compromised what had been built with faithfulness, repair it, not to yesterday's state, to the state you always planned. Sterixai, establishes, makes firm what was wavering. Where doubt about relevance, about purpose, about whether there is still something to offer in this season, stabilize it, not with fabricated certainty. With the firmness that comes from a foundation that doesn't depend on circumstances to be real. Stenosai, strengthens, infuses strength where there was weakness. It doesn't just repair what was there, it adds capacity beyond what was there before the pressure. Themeliosai, settles on a foundation, solidly grounds what had been built on a partially compromised foundation. God doesn't just repair the crack, He perfects the entire structure. Not just where you gave way, but the complete foundation. And here is the detail that most people skip. The verse begins with, after you have suffered a while. The structural restoration comes through the pressure, not in spite of it. Peter is not promising that you will avoid the pressure that finds the crack. He is promising that the pressure that finds the crack is the mechanism by which God identifies exactly what needs reinforcement. The lion that inspects the perimeter is not just a threat. In the sovereignty of God, it is also a structural inspection that reveals where reinforcement is needed. This doesn't make the enemy God's partner, but it makes God able to use even the enemy's pressure for the purposes of His engineering. Let's think about current situations. Let me describe 2 houses on a Thursday afternoon. The first belongs to Frank, 74 years old, retired for 4 years. For 42 years, he was the pastor of a mid-sized congregation in rural Tennessee. He married children, buried members, counseled families in crisis, preached more than 2,000 sermons, a man of genuine and proven faith. But Frank is sitting in his living room armchair with the remote control in his hand and the television off. He is not praying. He is not reading. He is simply sitting with that expression his wife has learned to recognize over the past 2 years, the expression of someone who is physically present and absent in everything else. Frank can't name what happened. He knows something changed. The prayer that for decades had been the structural center of his life now feels like a monologue to a ceiling. The Bible that he knows better than any other book now opens and closes without anything sinking below the surface. The ministry he exercised with genuine passion now seems like something that happened to someone else. He didn't lose his faith, but he lost access to it. And the explanation Frank gives himself is theological. Maybe God is putting me through a season of spiritual dryness, which sounds pious, which sounds like someone who understands the seasons of the spiritual life. But that's not what is happening to Frank. What is happening to Frank is that 42 years of being the structure for others, without ever building the rhythm of offloading and renewal that Jesus practiced, created a structural fatigue so deep that the numbness is now total. He cast everyone's anxiety upon the Father for decades, but he rarely cast his own. And the enemy, who patiently inspects the perimeter, found the crack. Not dramatically, silently. Frank didn't wake up one day and decide to distance himself from God. The distancing settled in gradually, in a structure that had been compromised for a long time, while Frank continued to appear solid on the outside. Now the 16-year-old grandson who attended church with his grandparents has stopped coming. Not because he had a dramatic crisis of faith, because he realized, one with the brutal sensitivity teenagers have for authenticity, that the grandfather who preached about the presence of God didn't seem to have access to that presence in everyday moments. And if that man, With all that experience, that marked-up Bible, that history, can't access what he preaches, maybe there is nothing to access. Frank doesn't know this, and he doesn't know that his grandson's distancing is rooted in his own untreated structural fatigue. The second house belongs to Beverly, 69 years old, a widow for 3 years. She lost her husband after 6 years of caring for him during a progressive illness. 6 years being the structure for someone, she gradually lost the ability to be a structure for herself. 6 years of accumulated fatigue, smiling in front of the kids so as not to add to their burden. When her husband died, Beverly expected to feel relief mixed with grief. She felt only exhaustion. The kind that goes beyond the physical, the kind that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. She could have done what Frank did, accept the numbness as a spiritual season and wait for it to pass. But Beverly did something different, not because she is more spiritual than Frank, but because an older friend from the congregation, a woman who had been through the same thing, sat her down and told her directly, "What you are feeling has a name. It's called structural fatigue. And it has a specific treatment. It's not praying more, it's offloading differently." Beverly learned to do what Peter describes in 1 Peter 5:7 in a way she had never practiced in 6 years of caregiving, casting with force, with specificity, with the deliberate intention of not picking it back up, not the weight of others, her own. She began to name out loud, not in a general prayer, but in a specific deposit, every layer of fatigue she had accumulated, the weight of having smiled when she wanted to cry, the weight of having said "I'm fine" when she wasn't, the weight of having served faithfully while her own structure was being consumed by the service. It took weeks. It wasn't dramatic. But gradually, the access returned. Prayer stopped being a monologue to the ceiling. The Bible had depth again. And one day, Beverly realized she had woken up without that feeling of weight on her shoulders that had become so constant she had stopped noticing it. And it was Beverly, not Frank, with his decades of formal ministry, who sat down with the 16-year-old grandson and had the conversation he needed. Not because she had the right answers, because she had a renewed structure that produced genuine presence. And genuine presence convinces in ways that arguments never can. The difference between Frank and Beverly is not experience or faithfulness or theological knowledge. It's that Beverly treated structural fatigue as what Peter says it is, a real spiritual vulnerability that requires specific intervention. And Frank is waiting for it to pass on its own. It won't pass on its own, it never does. There is a form of procrastination that is exclusive to people who have served faithfully for decades. And it is especially difficult to confront because it is wrapped in apparent virtue. It's called "I can handle it." It is the identity you've built over decades of being a strong person. And that identity has served a lot of people. Your children needed you to be strong. Your congregation needed it. Your spouse needed it. And you were strong. Consistently, with genuine faithfulness. But "I can handle it" as a permanent identity is structurally unsustainable, because no structure was designed to bear an infinite load without periodic offloading and renewal. Not bridges, not buildings, not you. And when you postpone recognizing structural fatigue, when you keep saying "I can handle it," even when the structure is compromised, you are not being strong. You are being negligent with the structure that others depend on you to maintain. Frank is not being humble by not treating his fatigue. He is being negligent toward his grandson, who needed his genuine presence and received a dulled presence. This is not an accusation, it is architecture. An untreated structure compromises everything that depends on it. But you might be thinking, compared to what other people face, my fatigue is not serious enough to treat. Peter doesn't make that distinction. He says, all your anxiety, all of it, not just the kind that passes a comparative seriousness test, all anxiety. And here is the architectural reality. A small weight not offloaded for long enough creates the same kind of structural damage as a large weight offloaded inadequately. The issue is not the size of the weight. It's how long it stayed concentrated without proper distribution. You have decades of small uncast weights. That is not insignificant. It is exactly the type of accumulated load that creates the cracks the enemy looks for. Or maybe Treating my fatigue feels selfish when there is so much need around me. Jesus withdrew regularly for renewal. Luke 5:16 says he often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed, not as an exception, as a pattern. And Jesus didn't do this because he needed to recover the same way we do. He did it because the principle of structural renewal is part of the design of how spiritual authority works in an incarnate life. If Jesus built a rhythm of structural renewal into his public life, no argument about the need around you can be stronger than his example. Taking care of your structure is not selfishness, it is stewardship. It's ensuring that what others depend on you to offer remains real and not merely apparent. Or you might also think, I don't know how to offload decades of accumulated fatigue. It feels too big to know where to start. Peter doesn't ask you to resolve decades in one afternoon. He asks you to start with the specific act of casting what is weighing you down right now, not the entire file of everything you've never offloaded. Today's weight, and then tomorrow's weight, and then the day after's. A structure doesn't recover instantly, but it starts to recover the very first moment the load is distributed correctly. Renewal is not an event, it is a process, and a process begins with a single specific act. There is something no one mentions about structural fatigue and legacy, but I need to touch on it. Your children and grandchildren are not going to inherit your sermons. They will not inherit your theology. They will not inherit the number of times you went to church or the ministries you served in. They will inherit the structural quality of your presence in the moments that mattered. And genuine presence requires a renewed structure. You cannot be genuinely present when you are structurally exhausted. You can be physically present. You can be functionally present. But the quality of presence that plants seeds the grandson will keep decades later, that the adult child will remember when they are in a crisis at 3 in the morning. That quality requires a structure that has been cared for. Beverly will leave her grandson the memory of a conversation that happened when her structure was renewed and she had genuine presence to offer. That conversation will germinate. In some future crisis, he will remember not what Beverly said, but what it was like to be in the presence of someone who had real access to what they professed. Frank can still have that conversation with his grandson, but he needs to treat the crack first. Not because God can't work through a compromised structure, God works through anything, but because Frank deserves to have real access to what he professed to others for decades. And the grandson deserves to receive genuine presence, not the echo of past faithfulness. The enemy inspecting Frank's perimeter has no interest in Frank abandoning his faith. He is interested in Frank continuing with the appearance of faith without real access to it. Because a Christian with appearance but no access threatens nothing. They do not plant seeds that germinate. They don't have conversations that stick. And the architectural irony is that treating fatigue, doing what seems selfish, stopping being the structure for everyone long enough to allow the renewal of your own structure, is precisely what makes you the threat the enemy doesn't want you to be. Peter knew this, because he went through it. Because the period between the denial and Pentecost was the period when Peter, for the first time in 3 years, stopped trying to be the structure for everyone and let his own structure be renewed. And when Pentecost arrived, the same man who had denied Jesus before a servant girl stood before thousands and preached with an authority that converted 3,000 people in a single day. Not because Peter had become stronger, but because his structure had been renewed by the only one who can do so. And that same renewal is available to you, not in a dramatic Pentecost, in the specific and deliberate act of beginning to cast, with force, with specificity, with the intention of not taking it back, the accumulated weight that is compromising the foundation. The prayer we are going to say together right now is an inspection and structural reinforcement. It is the moment you stop carrying the crack as if it were normal and begin the renewal process that Peter promises in verse 10. God will perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you, but you first need to cast what is preventing him from working. Before we pray, remember what I always ask. Stand up, back straight, feet firmly on the ground, shoulder width apart, like someone who is deliberately taking up space, not apologizing for existing. That is the posture of inspection. You're about to do what an engineer does before reinforcing a structure. Walk the perimeter, identify every tension point, name every crack. Not with anxiety. With the authority of someone who knows that the architect who will do the reinforcing is more capable than any pressure that created the damage. Ready? Then let's inspect and reinforce. Father, I come before you not as someone who is fine and wants to stay fine. I come as a structure that needs honest inspection and real reinforcement. For a long time I carried fatigue as if it were normal, as if it were the price of faithfulness, as if casting my own weight was a selfishness I wasn't allowed. But Peter says, cast it, with force, all of it. Not just what seems serious enough, all of it. So today, I cast it, not gently, with the force of epiripsentes, the deliberate hurl of someone determined not to pick it back up. Lord, I now name every layer of structural fatigue I have carried without casting. If you have paper, write it down as you declare it. If you don't, declare it out loud with specificity, not generically, with a name and an address. I cast the fatigue of having been a structure for others for decades without building a rhythm of renewal for myself. I do not regret having served. I regret having served without casting the weight of the service. I cast this now, with force, with no intention of picking it back up. I cast the fatigue of having smiled when I wanted to cry, at doctor's appointments, at family gatherings, at church services, in the moments when loneliness weighed heavy, and I chose not to show it because there were others who needed me to be strong. It wasn't a weakness to smile, but the structural cost of those smiles remained. And today, I cast it. I cast this now, with force, with no intention of picking it back up. I cast the fatigue of carrying in prayer the sorrows of everyone around me. Children, grandchildren, friends, congregation members, while rarely bringing my own with the same specificity and intention. I prayed for the pain of others, but I learned to minimize my own before even bringing it to you. I cast this now with force, with no intention of picking it back up. I cast the accumulated fatigue of years of uncertainty that I called faith, but was actually carrying alone the uncertainty about health, about finances, about children and grandchildren who took directions I wouldn't choose for them, about a world that changed in ways I don't recognize and that make me feel the experience I've accumulated might no longer be relevant. That weight stayed, silently, layer upon layer. I cast this now, with force, with no intention of picking it back up. Lord, I declare over every weight I just named, it is cast, it is transferred, it is in the hands that were designed to carry what my hands were not. You care for me, not in theory, in active and present practice, and I refuse to pick back up what I just cast. Now, Lord, I do what Peter calls sobriety and vigilance, not as anxious self-monitoring, but as correct directional orientation. I decree sobriety over my perception. I reject the numbness that accumulated fatigue installed. I reject the dulled perception that makes prayer sound like a monologue, that makes the Bible seem familiar without being alive, that makes the presence of God seem distant when it is not. This is not a spiritual season. It is a structural crack, and I name it for what it is. I decree, my perception is being restored right now. The access that seemed blocked is being unclogged, not by my effort, but because I cast the weight that was obstructing it. I reject the numbness. I receive sobriety of perception. Now, I decree vigilance over my perimeter, not obsessive self-monitoring, but a gaze oriented toward the correct horizon. Lord, you said through Peter, the enemy walks about seeking an entry. I declare now that I know the method. I know the doors that fatigue opens, and I am closing them. I close the door of dulled perception, because I cast the weight that created it, and I decree restored sobriety. I close the door of isolation as apparent protection, because I recognize that a structure without lateral support collapses, and I commit to staying connected to the community structures that were designed to distribute the weight that no single structure was meant to carry alone. I close the door of defensive rigidity disguised as firmness, because I recognize that hardness is not strength. Real strength is a renewed structure that can bend without breaking because the foundation is solid. Those doors are closed. The enemy may inspect the perimeter, He will not find an entry where there was a crack, because the crack is being reinforced right now. Lord, I now put on active resistance, anti-steat, not with fabricated strength of my own, but with the position that the correct foundation allows. I position myself on the foundation of 1 Peter 5:6, under your mighty hand, not under circumstances, not under the diagnosis, not under the silence of the children, not under accumulated fatigue, under your hand, which exalts in due time, which sustains in the process, which never lets go of what was placed under it. On this foundation I stand, and from this position I resist, not roaring back at the lion, with the silent firmness of a structure that knows what it is founded on. Father, I now receive what verse 10 promises: 4 actions, 4 layers of structural reinforcement. Katartisai, perfects, restores to the original state of functionality, where fatigue compromised what had been built with faithfulness. Repair it, not to yesterday's state, to the state you always planned. I receive this perfecting now, over every area where the structure was compromised without my realizing it. Sterixai, establishes, makes firm what was wavering, where doubt about relevance, about purpose, about whether there is still something to offer in this season. Stabilize it, not with fabricated certainty, with the firmness that comes from a foundation that doesn't depend on circumstances to be real. I receive this establishing now, over every point where the wavering had begun. Sthenosai, strengthens, infuses strength where there was weakness. It doesn't just repair what was there, it adds capacity beyond what was there before the pressure. I receive this strengthening now, not to carry more weight without offloading, to carry with a foundation that distributes the weight correctly. Themeliosai, settles on a foundation, solidly grounds what had been built on a partially compromised foundation. I receive this settling now, over the whole structure, over relationships, over purpose, over the presence that my children and grandchildren need from me. Genuine presence, not an echo of past faithfulness. Lord, I close this prayer with Peter's declaration about himself, not the Peter before the fall, but the Peter after the restoration. The Peter who wrote this letter knew he had been a compromised structure. He knew what it was to have the enemy find the crack, and he knew what it was to be restored by the one who perfects, establishes, strengthens, and settles. And it was this Peter, not the impulsive and apparently strong Peter of the beginning, who stood up at Pentecost with real authority. I decree over my life, the structural fatigue has been named, it has been cast. It will no longer be carried in silence as if it were the normal price of faithfulness. The cracks have been identified, the reinforcement has been received. The perimeter is under oriented vigilance, not anxious self-monitoring. The foundation is being renewed, not so I can go back to what I was, but so I can become what you always planned. And the presence my children and grandchildren will receive from me from now on will not be the dulled presence of an exhausted structure. It will be the genuine presence of a renewed structure. That is the inheritance I am building, not with words about faith, with a structure that allows real access to what I profess. In the name of Jesus Christ, the same who cooked fish for Peter by the lake before restoring him, the same who asks specific questions that reinforce specific cracks, the same whose power works forever and ever. Amen. You have a mission for the next 24 hours. Identify one person in your life, not a list of people, just one person with whom you stopped being genuinely present because your structure was compromised. It could be the grandson you answer distantly when he asks difficult questions. It could be the adult child with whom conversations have been superficial for so long that superficial became the standard. It could be the friend from the congregation who asks how you are and gets a fine thank you, when the honest answer would be different. It doesn't need to be a deep conversation today. You don't need to resolve decades of distance in one meeting. It needs to be an act of genuine presence, small, specific, intentional. A phone call, a lunch, a question asked with the real intention of hearing the answer. A renewed structure doesn't announce that it was renewed. It demonstrates it. And the demonstration begins with an act of presence that the person on the other side will notice, not because you said the right thing, but because there was someone genuine on this side. Do it today, before the end of the day. Now think of someone else, someone you recognized in this video. Not in Frank or Beverly by name, but in the pattern. Someone you know is silently carrying decades of structural fatigue and calling it faithfulness. Who is serving with the appearance of strength, while their foundation is compromised on the inside. Who might not even have the vocabulary to name what they are feeling because they've never heard anyone name it. Send this video to that person right now, without a long message, without an elaborate explanation. Just the video and maybe, "I thought of you when I watched this." Because sometimes the most pastoral thing you can do for someone is not a conversation. It's a tool that arrives with the right name for something the person was carrying without a name. And now I need to prepare you for what comes next. Because what we did today, inspecting the structure, casting the accumulated weight, closing the doors that fatigue had opened, receiving the 4 reinforcements of verse 10, that is foundational work. It's ensuring the structure can handle what is coming. And what is coming is direct confrontation, not from the enemy, from Jesus. In the next video, we are going to open Matthew and find a question that Jesus asks that no one can answer with indifference. It is not a theological question. It is not a question about doctrine or practice or ministry. It is a question that goes straight to the center of what produces anxiety, the anxiety that you rationalize, that you justify, that you call mature responsibility or Christian realism. Jesus asks this question to people who are worried. And the question is not soft, it is surgical. It is the type of question that, when you really hear it, not skim over it as a familiar verse, but truly hear it, reorganizes something internal that no anxiety management technique can touch. But here is what needs to be clear. You can only hear this question with a structure that has been inspected and reinforced. A compromised structure hears Jesus' question about anxiety and turns it into one more reason to feel inadequate. A renewed structure hears the same question and finds in it what Jesus intended it to be: liberation. Turn on the notification bell right now, because the question Jesus asks in Matthew cannot wait. And you, with the foundation that has just been reinforced, are in exactly the right position to receive it. The structure is renewed. The vigilance is active. I'll see you in the next video.